How can you tell if you live in a nation that is obsessed with news? Well, let me ask you. When you go out early in the morning, do you find people engrossed in their newspapers at the chai stalls? Or when you go to pick your clothes from the dry cleaners, is there a news channel blaring in the background on the television? On buses or metros, do you see people bent over their phone screens consuming online news content? Well, if your answer is yes to these questions, chances are that you do live in a news obsessed nation. And that nation, most likely, is India. The thing is that every time a new medium of news has come up in India, it has been immediately lapped up by the audiences. And each new medium has brought with it some big changes in the format, the content, and even the very meaning of the term news. For instance, there were not so many editorial pieces before the advent of online journalism. Now opinions pass off as journalism. Before TV news channels, there weren't many live debates in the media. But now debates are considered a necessary part of news programming. These changes in the meaning of news have also left open the doors for propaganda and misinformation. But then, have we ever been free of these evils in any news era? Many such changes in the news scene have happened in the past 3 decades. Online news made inroads into India in the past 20 years. Before that, television news got popular when private news channels were first introduced in the last decade of the 20th century. However, before online and TV news, the term news only evoked the image of the broadsheet of a newspaper in the public imagination. The entry of new media does not mean that the old media have had to disappear. Newspapers are still relevant in India with significant readerships, even though their popularity has declined in many other countries. In fact, newspapers are still so omnipresent that if you buy pakoda, bhel puri or chana zor garam from a street vendor, more often than not you will find it wrapped in a piece of a newspaper. Reselling and reusing newspapers is a trade in its own right in India. Newspapers have reigned for over 2 centuries as the definitive source of information in India. The first newspaper was introduced in the Indian subcontinent by a man called James Augustus Hickey in the year 1780. And in the next 200 years, not only were newspapers extremely popular, but they also came to define Indian journalism. However, newspapers do much more than that. In 1981, famed historian Benedict Anderson published his seminal work, Imagined Communities. In this book, he demonstrated how the development of newspapers was essential for framing national consciousness in various countries. You must be wondering how? Well, according to Anderson, the newspaper consumed simultaneously by disparate individuals allowed them to collectively participate in a daily tradition and build an imagination of themselves and their culture. They became an imagined community, which helped shape the idea of a nation. But what we need to understand is how newspapers were born in a country like India and who ran them. From our research, we came to know that this story wasn't all that smooth. It involved the destruction of one information ecosystem and the triumph of another. We also know that this origin story was primarily a European story set in a brutal colonial context in India. But what emerged from it was a tradition of holding power accountable, something that many Indian journalists even today hold on to as the main reason they still do the job. To understand this story, we need to go way back. We need to go back to a time before the proliferation of printing presses, before editors and reporters and pens that were mightier than swords. We must ask how the ordinary and not so ordinary people in India accessed information before the first printed newspaper was born. Did an information ecosystem even exist back then? And if it did, what did it look like? And who ran it? How did a new and different information ecosystem take its place? Is the story of Indian news and journalism just a story about new technologies making the old information ecosystems redundant? Or is there more to this story? Can this story tell us anything about the shape of the news in India's future? This is Reality Scribes. I am Sumit Chaturvedi.
And I'm Vasundhara and Sumit. We are Indian journalists who will, in this season, tell you the story of the origins of Indian journalism. We will take you through the history of Indian society's news and information ecosystems, our news culture, and how these have evolved over years, decades, and centuries. When we think about the history of journalism today, we often start with the first printed newspapers. However, there was an entire world of handwritten newsletters in India that existed before printed newspapers. The story of this handwritten or manuscript news world, why it existed, and what purpose it served is important, because this world was forced to die out when the printing press came to India along with European colonization. So, we are going to begin our story in the 18th century. At this time, the Mughal dynasty ruled large swaths of India. This dynasty had first established itself in India in the 16th century. By the mid-1700s, the Mughal Empire was still strong after 200 years of rule. However, they had competition from local rulers and from the politically ambitious, profit-seeking functionaries of a joint stock company from Britain called the East India Company. Over time, the British and the East India Company would win out over the Mughals, executing almost all of the ruling dynasty and their heirs in the aftermath of the Great Indian Revolt of 1857. However, in the 1700s, the British were still learning to read Indian society and its caste hierarchy, languages, religions, cultures, and subcultures. They were also up against the Mughal dynasty, which had a formidable monopoly over information. These two culturally distinct powers had different ideas of what purposes news and information served. But how did the Mughals come to dominate a hard-to-govern place like India? And how did the British wrest control of the subcontinent from this difficult-to-dislodge dynasty? To understand this, we spoke to Aparajita Das, a PhD student of Mughal history at the University of California at Berkeley. Aparajita told us that her interest in Mughals started with a coffee table book that she once saw about the architectural accomplishments of the Mughals. For our global listeners, the Taj Mahal is one of those architectural accomplishments built by a Mughal ruler called Shah Jahan. Today, Aparajita and her colleagues run the Long Afterlife of Mughal Monuments project, where they work with school students in sites around Delhi and Meerut, such as the Sheesh Mahal and Shahpir Dargah. Their project is supported by the Institute of South Asia Studies at UC Berkeley. Aparajita, how did the British manage to take control of the subcontinent from the Mughal dynasty? It seemed to be something that was really difficult to dislodge.
The Mughal Empire becomes somewhat smart at managing a vast place like South Asia by 1580s, which is where we start hearing about systematization of rule. How it does it is, it includes all kinds of people within its ranks: Rajputs, Kayasts, Khatris, who become wielders either of arms or of pens for the Mughal Empire. As it fights its big fights against the Afghans of North India and the sultans of the south. So that's the large story of the Mughal Empire. Like any empire, it is highly expansive, it is imperial, it is unequal, it is hierarchical, just like the Tudors, the Ottomans, the Habsburgs, the Qing dynasty in China. Violent? Yes. Elitist? Yes. Collaborates with Rajputs largely. Caste is not something that Mughal India overrode, right? It built on a caste system and requires wielding both arms and information. One of the big debates in Indian history has largely been how did a group of traders from Britain manage to acquire such immense political power in a place like India? There are two ways of thinking about it largely. One is to think of the British in the 18th century as not doing anything very different from anyone else in South Asia. They were power brokers, they were looking for profit as any kind of other trader in India and any kind of political actor in India. Everybody had a political stake, and Many actors, the Sikhs, the Rajputs, the Afghans, the Mughals, were all part of the same story of trying to manage whatever they can, the Mughals being the most important. By the end of the 18th century, the British emerge as the most important because they have managed to not only capture revenue, but they have also basically fashioned themselves in the best ways possible as the legitimate, or they think they are the most legitimate rulers of South Asia. Now, there's another group of historians who will say, instead of seeing the British as, oh, conquerors, they're one amongst the many people who try to vie for power here. Now, another group says, no, not really. This is not that, oh, they're just traders and they land up with political power. No, they've always had political ambition. That political ambition since 1600, since the start of the East India Company, relies on trying to look for the knowledge systems of India, trying to identify how India should be governed, creating forts. Whenever they got permissions to trade in India, they fortified the place. There are since the 1640s, the British had forts of their own. They ran courts in parts of South India. They administered justice and kept their own armies. So this is the large debate as to how did this happen. Was it one moment? Was it always there? And so on. It essentially becomes a question of how did the British tap into pre-existing information and knowledge systems.
While the newspaper, in the way we understand the term today, is often credited to the Europeans, in every single society across space and time, there have been distinct mechanisms of information transfer between people, classes, and places in either oral, written, or later printed formats. In Mughal India, this system was elaborate, state-controlled, and functioned like a well-oiled machine. So what did this system look like? At first, it performed the solitary function of transferring information, decrees, and edicts between nobles and chiefs and the imperial court. It was more like a postal system. Later, intelligence gathering was added, and the system became layered. In fact, at the height of the Mughal Empire, every district had a Waqai-Navis, or a news writer, or in a more literal sense, incident recorder, who was tasked with sending a report on the district he covered to the imperial court every week. Aparajita told us more about who the Waqai-Navis were and what they did.
Waqai-Navis is the person who writes. Navisi is to write. So a person who writes. And then there's a Waqai-Nigari or Waqai-Nigar is the person who keeps track of the happenings. The Navis writes or is the reporter. But the incident that happened is the Waqayat, or the moment in which it happens. Waqai-Navis would keep a small record of what was happening in each court. What do I mean by each court? There's an emperor in the center and there are many small provinces, and then within the provinces they have their own officials. Everyone kept a small court. Everyone recorded on paper whatever happened in the court and sent it back and forth. Those stories tell us really random information, like in the city of, let's say, Burhanpur, which is in present-day Madhya Pradesh. One man came to an old woman's house to ask for water. When she came out to give him water, it was heard that the man had disappeared. This has happened for 1 week. There is probably a miraculous man roaming around Burhanpur. So this world requires information of crime, of religiosity, of spirit, of who are these spiritual people roaming around, who can plot a rebellion, who can attack the army, who has his eyes on the treasury. And in all of this, a vast variety of individuals become important, including the formal networks of spies, the formal networks of news reporters, courtly people, diplomats who kept a sharp eye on what is happening in other people's courts. Courts exchanged diplomats and they knew they were being reported. And a vast variety of people who we call Harkaras, who could go slip in and out of the system as required. To be able to again read the Waqai record, you really need the specialized knowledge of the scribe, the specialized knowledge of the script in which a Kayasth, a Saxena, a Bhandari, or even a Mathur would have written that report.
The system that the Mughals had set up was solely dedicated to information gathering. Venetian traveller Nicola Manucci has recorded in his Storia dei Mogol how the reports of the Vakai Navis were transmitted to the king. The women of the palace would gather at 9 pm and read out the reports to the king, who was Aurangzeb in this instance, and the king would often stay up until midnight charting courses of action based on what he had learned. Sumit and I found this particularly interesting because it showed women reading in medieval India, when a relatively standard trope is that women were commonly denied education. We would want to know more about the educational status of women in those times. So if you're a historian listening and you know more about this, tell us. Write into us. Often, there was mischief involved in this process of news reporting. Wealthy local chiefs would bribe the Vakai Navis to publish false reports or omit some events like a military loss. A particular incident is recounted by Major General William Sleeman when describing Awadh's Ghulam Hussein's defeat. Sleeman, who published Rambles and Recollections in 1844, said, Ghulam Hussain was so ashamed of the drubbing he got that he bribed all the news writers within 20 miles of the place to say nothing about his defeat in their reports to the court. So the king was blissfully unaware. Therefore, the point to note is this: these were often unreliable reports. Nevertheless, these handwritten reports became a part of the manuscript press of the day. The functionaries of the East India Company caught on to this very quickly and even appointed their own local agents to publish their complaints in these news reports so that the Mughal imperial court could see them. The Vakai Navis were indeed notable in their day, and some of their reports still exist and have been preserved. There were also Savani Nigars, who sent reports about 8 times a month. You could think of them as special correspondents. The Mughals also created a group of spies called the Khufiya Navis, who were deeply feared in local communities, especially since they often went unrecognized and bypassed the local information hierarchy, sending their reports directly to the court. They were like modern-day intelligence agents. And then, at the bottom of this hierarchy were the Harkaras, the runners who walked for miles every day carrying missives written in coded scripts on tiny squares of paper that they tucked into their turbans.
The word Harkara, as far as we can tell, etymologically derives both from the Indic/Hindi word har, har din, har roz, every. And Kara comes from the word kar, the Farsi word kar, any kind of work. So Harkara meaning basically denotes expansiveness, many things, someone who can do a lot of things. Jo har kaam kare. So what it shows us is that these people did many tasks, but it doesn't mean that they were not specialized. They bore some sort of specialized knowledge and they were trained. They were trained from a very early age. Various caste groups trained their members who became Harkaras of different sorts very differently, but they could also have very specialist knowledge. So it's a large term that encompasses many kinds of then smaller subsets of skills.
Were these guys also sort of martially trained?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, you're right. A lot of them could be martially trained. 2 things. A, they were martially trained. If you were out on the road, these are heavily forested places, and yet you have to imagine that often there were large trains, whether of soldiers, whether of banjaras, who carried grain, salt, merchant trails, that were endangered in these forests. We have reports as late as 1880 that places like Awadh were heavily either forested, that they weren't urban sites. It wasn't heavily populated. They may not be matchlock men. They may not have guns with them. They knew lathi. They knew from childhood using a lathi, using a sword were things that were taught to particular kinds of men. Sword is again a very caste-based system. Not everyone gets to wield a sword, but a katta, a chaku. Chaku is a Turkish term, were available. People would keep a dagger with them if they were roaming around in the forests, if they had to travel the forest. But like I said, the fun of Mughal India is that the same people who become informants could actually become bandits later. And the same bandit, if someone is able to pay them well, if someone is able to control an area and tell them, actually, you know what, stop raiding this treasury, stop raiding the treasure that's going, stop raiding these merchants who are going, Why don't I pay you better? You join my army. So they could say, join me, take this money from me, join me, and you become the informants. So it was a very back and forth system, and that is why control of information and power became important. Sometimes a local warlord could probably get hold of information at the right time, create a big army of his own, and rebel. The other thing to keep in mind is all of these people that I have mentioned, archers or merchants, traders, could also be informants. In fact, Banjaras and merchants became amongst the most important information bearing communities. And the second thing around that is that it was also gendered. Women played an important role within these networks of communities. So, what I'm trying to say is that on paper, in our texts, in texts like Aine Akbari or any of these official chronicles, official documents from the court, this seems like a very solid hierarchical system, very steel machinery like everybody knows what they're doing, everybody has responsibilities. But in practice, it was a much more fluid system where you could work for the state or not, where you had a particular role or not, where someone else could become your employer or not.
In addition to this formal system of information and incident recording, the Mughals had also developed a method of recording the emperor's daily proceedings and letters from envoys at the imperial court into a daily manuscript newsletter. These records are called the Akhbarat, deriving from the Persian word khabar, which means news. These Akhbarats were handwritten in Persian in the Shikasta script and read out aloud during the daily darbar or court proceedings. Envoys and nobles from local states would take notes and send them back to their dominions. In 1828, Colonel James Todd acquired nearly 3,000 such folios, possibly when he lived in Rajasthan as an agent of the East India Company. He sent them to the Royal Asiatic Society in London, which has recently digitized them. The papers were on average 8 inches by 4.5 inches in size and handwritten in Shikasta. They are now available on the website of the Royal Asiatic Society. Most of these folios pertain to the reign of the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb and have formed the basis of Todd's later work, The Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan, published in 2 volumes in 1829 and 1832, and have informed the work of newer historians as well. Aparajita is one of those newer historians and has dedicated a significant amount of time to mastering Shikasta and decoding the material in the surviving Mughal archive.
I spend my mornings trying to read really hard Persian script written by these specialized kayasts who were trained to write a kind of, it is called a scribal script, Shikasta, which means
Right.
it's broken. Shikast means किसी को शिकस्त देना, to break them, to defeat them. So the Shikasta script is a broken script that very specialized knowledge bearers could write, and Kayasts, Khatris, some obviously elite Muslims were trained in writing them and writing quickly, writing quick amounts of data. It was a database script. Yeah, we spend a lot of our time if we work on documentation trying to just master the Shikasta script. If we read manuscripts, ornate manuscripts, beautifully made, brilliant margins. I mean, you could just spend hours just thinking of the manuscript as, like I said, a luxury item. You must have seen Mughal miniature paintings. All of this is the work of paper.
Aprajita, what kind of archival value those papers have? Could you just tell us about that?
Actually, again, Babur, he brings some paper from Samarkand. He's traveling with books, and Samarkand is in present day Uzbekistan. Prior to that, we import paper from Egypt. In some ways, I think the Mughals also benefit from making very smart decisions about who to recruit, who to ally with. They ally with the Rajputs largely in decimating their adversaries, the Afghans and the Sultans of the south. What they're able to do is elevate local karkhanas, local production centers, Agra, Bayana, Surat, parts of Patna, large parts of Bengal, places in the Punjab near Lahore. They're able to make them into big centers that the empire requires. From household level production or specialized caste based productions, they become the consumers of goods. Paper production in Kashmir, it becomes a really important industry, and it's not just the Mughals who are important there. Kashmir is actually an exception in the sense that the Sufi sheikhs set up handicraft centers that still benefit Kashmiris of today. As late as the 1670s, there are examples of European travelers like John Fryer who are talking about, you if you know about this place in Maharashtra, Kalyan. It's a big junction when you have to change the train from
Yeah,
Western
yeah, yeah.
Railway to North Central and so on. There are these descriptions of these sheikhs producing paper in in small mills. And so they could be smaller industries or people in very small groups producing paper. If a Mughal prince says, actually, you know what, this paper is really important, let's create a proper karkhana, let's specialize it, you have those two. By the late 17th, definitely by the early 18th century, there are vast amounts of very different and very specialized paper that's being produced. And you're right, to one extent, India is also a really humid place. At least parts of eastern India are very humid. We don't have so much paper remains. A lot of it gets got dissolved, couldn't stand the ravages of time. But a lot of stuff that was produced in slightly drier places like the Deccan, like Hyderabad, like I said, Aurangabad, these are drier places, not so wet as, say, Bengal or parts of Bihar. So Deccan, Hyderabad, Rajasthan, and Gujarat, those kinds of sources that we find there, because these are just drier places, amazing. Right now, we have like 10% of the Mughal archive left, including the documents, including the
Right.
petitions that went, including the documents giving out land to people, giving out taxation decrees, correspondences, quarterly records, manuscripts, people's diaries, household manuals. We we have so much dispersed across the archives in India, Pakistan, some parts of Bangladesh. Dhaka University has good stuff, and large parts of Europe. I mean, colonialism is a different story. So there are huge manuscripts in
Right.
the British Library, in France, some in Germany. So that paper remains. It's been able to stand the test of time. Not all of it, like I said, very little is left.
As Aparajita tells it, paper was a luxury commodity difficult to manufacture. This limited availability of paper, combined with the lack of movable type in any local language until the late 1700s, made the handwritten manuscript press the default source of news and information in the Mughal court. Such structural and technological handicaps made the consumption of this state controlled information elite oriented.
The purpose of describing this Mughal information ecosystem is to let you know that information moved in this society before the invention of the newspaper and before the British colonization of our country. In fact, some of the early military failures of the British East India Company can be attributed to them not being able to penetrate or piggyback on this information system. They changed that by the late 1800s. The officers of the East India Company began recruiting Mughal agents, often Harkaras who came from marginalized groups. And ahead of military expeditions, these men were sent to scout, survey, and map. Sometimes there was a definite lack of trust between the Harkaras and their British overlords. In recorded instances, Harkaras, the everyday runners who were now spies for the company, were whipped or hanged if they failed at their tasks. C.A. Bailey describes how after the intelligence failures that plagued the Battle of Assaye in 1803, Arthur Wellesley and Colonel Stevenson were reported to have had their head Harkaras hanged for dereliction of duty. What had happened? Well, Harkaras, who had reportedly scouted routes to the enemy's lines, told Wellesley he was about 10 or 12 miles away from the enemy's encampment. It turned out he was only a mile away. His army had been misled either deliberately or through poor scouting. Very little is recorded in historical texts about Harkaras, but every little paragraph that we could find on them pointed to how they formed the backbone of the Mughal Empire's information gathering enterprise, and later they did the same for the British. The simple point is this: knowledge is an active force in history. So are knowledge and information gatherers. The story of news, as we understand the term today, is fraught with violence, politics, indigenous social formations, class, caste, race, and empire. When we think of these big terms, we often lose sight of the people who made up this system. And those at the bottom of these stories, like the Harkaras in our tale, are erased from popular history.
For the colonial empire, rendering a conquered society legible was paramount. For military victories, local information was paramount. Yet, for the British Empire, the inner world of the Indians served no strategic purpose. In other words, they had no use for affective knowledge or the knowledge that comes from participating in the customs, beliefs, and inner spiritual worlds of any community. Unlike the Mughals, who received reports on everything from massacres to miracle men performing supernatural feats, the British considered the latter irrational. Thus began a transformation in the meaning of news. Besides the knowledge systems of affect, the information gatherers also came from patrimonial communities, about which Aparajita told us more.
These Harkaras come from a wide variety of groups, which some historians call patrimonial communities. That means that these are communities that are tied through kinship, caste, marriage, bhaichara, brotherhood. You may not be related by blood, but you have grown up together in the same caste group, and you can be dur ka bhai and so on, a distant brother. And these people, your nephew may be trained by your brother to become either a runner, either a spy, either someone who just roams around seemingly around the bazaar in a city and gathers some sort of information, knows how to code it, or they could be trained in scribal skills, write the same language that we are speaking in the most difficult to read Persian script, broken Persian script, which is the bane of most Mughal historians' existence because it's such difficult script to read. So this is specialized kinds of knowledge based on either what caste you're born into or what kinds of access to information you have. Some Harkaras, like I said, it's a large term. Some could just be very good at disguising themselves and informing the state about whether there's a raid that's possible, a bandit raid that's possible, or whether someone's plotting a rebellion. And all of this information would be, there's a lot of back and forth. The Harkaras are not the only people. Like I said, it's a large term used for a variety of people. They would be reporting on official basis. On in principle, this information and reportage system had many overlaps. People who could be adversaries of the Mughals could act on paper in our document, could actually be providing information to them if the political or even a social opportunity emerged.
In 1757, the East India Company won its most crucial battle in India, the Battle of Plassey, which gave the company a foothold in Bengal. What began as a poor corporation was now turning into a political and capitalist leviathan that came to rule India for the next century. In this podcast, we will focus on the history of news and information that ran parallel to the story of colonial exploitation, corporate greed, and arbitrary rule. By the 1800s, the old ways of collecting and distributing news were gone. Handwritten newsletters were replaced with printed ones. The Harkaras, our news carriers from the Mughal era, had new jobs under new masters. Priceless historical manuscripts were destroyed when fortresses were sacked in battle or carted away by victors. With their destruction, entire worlds of knowledge and histories were lost. We can only piece together the past from what has survived. What we do know is that when the Mughal system of information and news gathering began to die, something else was slowly taking its place. People would always be eager to know what was going on around them. Entrepreneurs would come who would see money in this new technology of printing and start newspapers. Rulers and governments would come who would try to shut these newspapers down. Many newspapers would die in the wake of government crackdowns. Others would spring up to take their place. Editors would be deported, and some would die heartbroken and penniless. The Indian story of modern journalism began in this crucible of colonialism. By the time the first newspaper started in India in 1780, something had fundamentally shifted in the world. Information was being seen as a consumer product that could be sold. It could no longer be the preserve of the elite. However, information was also a weapon that could be used by anybody if they could find a way to be heard. As the East India Company was going to find out, its own personnel harbored grievances against each other because they were all seeking one thing: profit. Some of these traders and military officers would take to expressing their grievances publicly. The story of one such unscrupulous man who tried to use what he knew about the East India Company to bring it to heel is what you're going to hear next on Reality Scribes.
We would like to especially thank Aparajita Das for sharing her invaluable insights and time with us. Reality Scribes has been conceptualized, scripted, narrated and produced by Vasundhara and me, Sumit Chaturvedi. All source material used in this episode can be found in the description below. The views expressed by guests on the podcast are their own and do not always reflect the opinions of Reality Scribes or the podcast hosts. You can listen to Reality Scribes on iTunes, Spotify, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Don't forget to like, share, and comment, and do subscribe to our channel. Also click the bell icon for notifications for when we drop a new episode. You can follow us on social media at Reality Scribes on X, Instagram, Facebook, and Patreon. You can also email us your questions and comments at realityscribes@gmail.com for a chance to be featured on our podcast. Thank you for listening. Until next time.